So what do you do when your business partner just disappears? Your business is doing well and they just want to head out and enjoy life. Maybe they've stopped showing up for reasons they don't explain. Maybe they or someone in their family's gotten sick, or maybe they've gotten distracted and they're pursuing some new venture. Whatever it is, for some reason right now, you feel like you're carrying the weight of everything and you realize you never really had an agreement for how to handle this. It's not unusual. Partnerships often last decades, but life changes over that period of time. Priorities change. The real issues that come up in partnerships are when agreements don't evolve with life. Here's the real question. How do you realign or renegotiate expectations? If you're growing a business and you're scaling it, and this is hitting close to home for you, then this video will give you a clear strategic path forward. All right, when you realize that a partnership is going sideways and that one of your partners isn't really living up to maybe the agreements that you thought you had or the understanding that you thought you shared, here's how you can begin to renegotiate it. The first thing that I encourage that you do is you go back to your organizational values. Assuming that you've written these down, this is probably a meaningful process for all of you. And I like to encourage people to go back to them because they provide a common ground. And so, for example, if there was something in your values, and there often is, that talks about treating each other with respect or communicating clearly or communicating well, any kind of a value that you feel like helps speak to the quality of relationship and the nature of communication, I would go back to it and make sure that A, you're really working in alignment with those, and that B, you can ask your partners to help come into alignment with those as well. If you haven't written those values, and that's not part of something you've done, then I would just look at your own personal values. What's most important to you? I find that when there's disagreements, the two things that most people speak about have to do with trustworthiness or honesty and respect. And when both of those things are in place, it makes it easier for conversations to work. The second thing that I would look at is your legal framework for your relationship. This is usually in a document, at least in United States companies, in an operating agreement. Within your operating agreement, there's often a clause called a buy-sell clause. This may be a separate clause or a separate document as well. Either way, I would look that language up because that's essentially the contract that gives you the default agreements. If you can't agree to something else, that's the bottom line set of rules that you've already agreed to and that you're contractually bound to in terms of how you navigate your partnership. So I would look at that first because that is already the legal framework that you have. Now, the problem with those is most of the time they A, aren't written very well, and so they don't assume partnerships that evolve or change over time. B, they usually haven't been updated over time. So they may be 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, and you haven't even looked at them. And they no longer really make sense for where your partnership is actually at. And so in either case, I would sit down, make sure you know what's there, but you may have to renegotiate some of those parts, or at least be open to renegotiating that if you want the partnership to work. Oftentimes this just means clarifying specific aspects of it. In the second part of this video, I will explain some of the key elements of that you'll want to discuss and talk about with your partners. The third thing that I recommend that you do is to try to really pay attention to the relationship. And by this, I mean two things. One is to acknowledge, is there anything that you might have done that may have pushed your partner away? Chances are that there aren't, or it wasn't, but it's possible that there was something that you did that caused them to not feel as comfortable in the business or to not want to be there. It's at least worth checking that and thinking about that, maybe even asking them about it, because if there's a relational issue, then any of your negotiation is going to be harder to do if there's some kind of a breakdown in relationship or trust. The second thing you can do in terms of paying attention to the relationship is to affirm your partner. Right? There's a very kind of stereotypical Oreo method or plus minus plus method of affirming somebody and saying something nice, then giving them the cold hard truth, and then saying something nice again. People see that coming, but it's also true. But it only works if you mean it. And people can sniff test this pretty easily. They can tell if you're being sincere, if you're just saying stuff. And so what I would do is sit down and really think through, what do you value about this person? Try to remember, why did you want to partner with them to begin with? What's the attribution or the contributions, I should say, that they brought to the partnership that were important? Why do you want them to still be active and involved in the business? Be prepared to communicate those things and open yourself up a little bit to your partner so they feel like you actually want them in the relationship and you want them for them. When they feel that way, it makes it easier for them in most cases to engage because the relationship doesn't feel as threatening. If this kind of situation sounds familiar, you are not alone. Many business owners hit a wall when a partner steps back or changes their level of engagement without a clear plan. But it doesn't have to stay this way. If you're looking for deeper guidance on how to protect or grow your company through these kinds of situations, and for ways to be able to realign expectations with partners, go to christianmuntean.com. You'll find resources and insights designed specifically for scaling businesses with strong and sustainable leadership. The link's right at the top of the description. The fourth thing that I would recommend is that you schedule a real conversation and that you find an appropriate place for it. So don't, drop a bomb on somebody at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday and say, hey, we need to re-talk about our whole partnership and figure this out. That's bad timing, and it's rough for people to do that. What I would do is I would schedule a time, say, let's refigure this out. Something's not working. We need to discuss this. And I would set it up in a place where you're not likely to get interrupted, in a place that's conducive for both of you or all of you to have a good conversation. In cases where the level of distrust or animosity or frustration is so high, I would recommend possibly considering bringing in a facilitator for the conversation. But in most cases, people can handle this on their own if they commit to relating to each other with respect, with integrity, and just setting aside a good space and a good amount of time to have the conversation. Also recognize that this may be a series of conversations. It may be that it takes some time to really explore both how is everybody feeling right now and what does everybody want, and then how to structure that in a way that makes sense moving forward. And then speaking about moving forward, that brings me to my final point, which is be prepared to not just have a conversation where you finally get to a point where everybody feels better and then just saying, okay, good, glad we had that conversation and walking away, because the chances are high people will remember that conversation differently. What you want to do is plan on actually formally restructuring your partnership. So putting what you've talked about down into language, and I would recommend, because this is really it's a legal and a financial relationship, taking the basic components of your thoughts, giving them to an attorney, asking them, don't do crazy things with this, just make sure that this is legally sound and it's structured in a way that will make sense and that we're not overlooking anything. All right, now in the final part of this video, I want to talk about some of the major sticking points that partners often have, and if you have good conversations around them, how you can strengthen your partnership agreement, whatever the document is, and you can make it more robust and more helpful to you in the future. So the first part of this, and this can either be in your operating agreement or in a separate policy document, doesn't really matter so much, but it is to have a written understanding of the differences of roles that you have. And I don't mean just the roles that each partner carries within the organization, although that's part of that. But the real roles that I'm talking about is that most, for entrepreneurial businesses, entrepreneurial owners, most started out as operator owners. They come into the business as owners, but also as builders, as people who are working in the business. And then over time, what tends to happen is some people decide they don't want to be an employee or to work in the business, they just want to own the business, or they want to change some aspect of how much they work in the business. Sometimes it's the other way around. I have seen it. It's rare, but it happens where people want to keep working in the business, but they don't want ownership of the business. And so what you want to do is recognize that these are two different hats and they're two separate roles, even if they seemed enmeshed together at the beginning of the relationship and at the beginning of the business. They're really two different ones. And if you relate to them differently, and in particular, if you compensate them differently, you'll have a much healthier relationship and healthier conversations. So I would recommend that you define different responsibilities for the employee side of what people do, and then for the owner side, they're different roles, and then compensate the employee side of what you do based off of fair market value. If you had to hire somebody to replace yourself or your partners, what would it cost to hire that person? And then set your compensation around that. And then the owners are compensated separately through dividends or distributions or draws or whatever the language is that's common with how your business is set up. All of it means mostly the same thing. How do you take profits out of the business? And I would define specifically how that is going to be structured for the ownership side. So those are two different kinds of compensation. And what that allows, instantly makes it easier that if somebody wants to change their ownership role but still wants to work in the company, these are not enmeshed roles anymore and enmeshed in compensation, and you can make changes either as owner or as the level of employee engagement. That can change without changing the ownership side intrinsically. Now, if you're in the kind of business where you believe that being an employee and being a contributor is intrinsically tied to ownership, and quite a few businesses do structure that way, that's fine. You just have to understand that as you get older, as you get more successful, as things may change, you may also want to change the way you operate in your business. And so you just want to be sure, do I really want to have to be involved in the same way for forever? Am I really willing to be all out when I'm out? And if not, be honest about that and look for off-ramps or ways to begin to change the relationship and put that in writing. Also, if you want to tie those together and say, no, if you're going to own this, you have to be a full-time operator as well, then what I would do is I would write in realistic performance expectations, not unrealistic. I worked with a client once where it was an engineering firm, and they required all owners of the company, everyone that had bought shares into the company, to be 100% billable all the time. That's already a difficult bar to reach. And what it meant is none of the owners were given any time or would be compensated for any time spent in management or leadership tasks, which is an unrealistic scenario. And it created tension in that company. So I would make sure that whatever you're writing is realistic in the sense of being human and livability and actually operating your business well. The third thing I would discuss has to do with decision-making capacities. What kinds of decisions do owners make versus what kinds of decisions do employees or managers make? So when you're wearing your employee hat or your manager hat, what are the decisions that fit in that space versus the decisions that you make as an ownership team? And again, at the beginning, if it's maybe just the owners that are the only employees, it may not make sense to separate those things out. But just imagine what happens if you have 50 employees or 200 employees or 1,000 employees. The kinds of decisions that you'll be required to make at a management level shouldn't always be kicked up to the ownership team. So you want to begin to separate those things out, write it on paper so that there's good agreement moving forward. And then the last piece, and I touched on this earlier, has to do with money and how distributions or money will be shared or money decisions will be made. And so again, you want to be able to write down your policies specifically around how you're going to share profits. And so this is, part of how you figure out your compensation, but you want to decide specific things like, are we going to share a certain percentage of profits every year, or does it change? And do we have a process for deciding that change? Having a conversation around, do we do this quarterly? Do we do this monthly? Do we do this annually? Just think through how you want that to be shared, because it helps remove a potential annual sticking point or friction point that doesn't need to be there. And the last thing that I recommend is to have an agreement around, again, you can write this into your agreements. That's what I would recommend, whether it's your formal operating agreement or separate policy. But I would say that you have an agreement around regularly reviewing your operating agreements and buy-sell language. Best practice is to review this every 3 to 5 years. I recommend reading it just to refresh yourself and remind yourselves on an annual basis to read through them. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes most of the time. But you want to make sure they make sense, that they still seem to answer questions, that they still seem to serve a purpose as well. My advice is this: when people form businesses and partnerships, they do it because they usually like the other people and they believe we're gonna have a lot of fun together. This is going to be a great adventure, a great opportunity. This is going to be wonderful. And so my encouragement is, now that things have started to feel weird, use the document not as this rigid legal document, but use it or build it to be a tool that helps move the relationship back towards each other again. And so that's the healthiest and most valuable way to structure these documents. When I review them and help rewrite them for clients, I always write them from the perspective of, the relationship used to be good. How can this document help support that and help move people back towards trusting, open, honest communication again? And so that would be my advice and my recommendation to you. So whether a partner checks out, faces some kind of real crisis that they do need to deal with, or they just maybe weren't the right fit from the start, you now have a way to move forward with some clarity. by realigning expectations and putting better agreements in place. But even with the right kind of agreements in place regarding your partnership, you need the right kind of business structure if you actually want to scale. That's why I created a video breaking down exactly how I'd build a business from the ground up today using the same framework that I use to help companies scale to 10, 20, $50 million a year in revenue and beyond. It's popping up on the screen right now. Click it and I'll walk you through that.